When you are a passerby in the city, your default expectation as a passerby is that people around you will behave as anonymous stranger, and that will behave also as anonymous stranger with respect to them, with equivalent rights and obligations. And it also means that meeting by chance with someone we know is something which is rare and noticeable in this traditional view of the city. This has many implications in terms of what Goffman called the interaction order, and some characteristic phenomena such as civil inattention, and perhaps less well known but as important, the notion of unlooking that Goffman developed as constitutive of that particular interaction order in the city. And this has many other implications of urban planning or political theory, because it's the basis of a notion of the city as an instantiation of a democratic space with participants having equal rights and obligations. So what I'll try to do is try to show you how mobile locative media, games, locative and web social networking applications, dating applications, they provide or support another type of encounter, which has an hybrid character. And what is characteristic of this type of encounter is the fact that this kind of application, locational application, allows you to discover other users on your screen, and knowing that these other users are close by. And by close by, that means that you can probably see them on encounter physically, not only on screen. And I think that kind of mutual discovery of what we call co-proximity events is a central feature of most of these locative media applications. And another important feature of these particular forms of encounter, where you discover other users close by on your screen and possibly also in real life, is that these are no more complete strangers, because most of locative application, games, social networking, social networks, or dating applications, they provide you with other information about the other users close by, and to that other user information about you, if you're the one making that experience of a chance encounter on screen in locative aware media. So that means that you are not mutually complete strangers in the traditional sense of Goffman's metropolis, but you are both. These are people you don't know and you've never met, so they are strangers in a certain sense, but they're also people you know through the kind of information that the application provides to you. And so there's that kind of duality and ambiguity. I try to use the expression pseudonymous strangers to describe that. Makes for very particular features of encounter in public places when you're connected to that kind of applications. So I will just give you a few vignettes of such encounters taken from different applications and different ethnographic studies to try to get you a feel of what is specific, and also might be different between these encounters. So probably because I don't have much time, I'll drop this one. This one is a game. So it's the game I spoke briefly yesterday for those of you who were there, which is Dragon Quest IX. It's a proximity game. Players have to get close together to play. And yesterday I showed a gathering of players in Bercy Park in Paris. This is another gathering of players at the station of Shizuoka. A few players arranged to meet every Saturday there. And this is a typical encounter between players. You see, the guy in the middle is a newcomer. And what he does is he has introduced himself to the guy on the right as a player, and they start so they're introduced in the real life, mutually introduced in the real life, and they're looking at their phones to perform some kind of action which their closeness allow them in this proximity game. So when they do that, they do something that's characteristic of this hybrid encounter. They align their interaction in the real life, because they have introduced one another and they're talking, and they align that with what happens on screen. So they get access mutually to the screen and they try to do things together. So they combine the resources of traditional co-presence and the encounter on screen to to perform some game actions. In that particular study, you see in the end of a picture there's a McDonald's. And at one point in the study, there's a woman, a young woman, who came from McDonald's, and she sat on the small monument you have on the left for some time. And she had a mobile phone, but having a smartphone in your hand in Japan is very banal, so that doesn't mean anything. She stayed for some time, and then she left. And we happened to talk with her because we had found her behavior somewhat intriguing. Actually, it transpired that she was also a player. But unlike the guy in the middle, she came to be close to the other players, but she didn't introduce herself. She elicited not to make herself known, her presence known to the other players, beyond the fact that on screen, because of her proximity, she could interact with other players. So in that case, what she did, that woman, was to try not to align what happened in real life, what happened on screen, not to talk to the player, not to make a presence known by talk to the other players, but still to be able to interact with them on screen. So here you've got a kind of disarticulation of what goes on screen and what goes on in real life. And with my colleague Yoriko Inada, we've used a Japan term they use to describe these encounters, very nice, which is timid encounters. But you see with both cases that the fact that you can experience the other person in the traditional embodied way, and that you can experience the other person on screen in some way, which is shaped and designed by the application interface, that provide resources for complex trajectories, which can play with what happens in one domain and what happens in the other domain to shape your encounter in different ways. Timid encounters or fully fledged hybrid encounter. This is a story told by users of an application called Grindr, which is used by the male gay community to organize short-term encounters of a sexual nature somehow. And in this case, it's one user which told us about his experience of using Grindr in a gay bar in Paris. And he said this: "Once happened to see a guy near me in a bar, and between what he gave off and what he had put in his profile, I found that completely paradoxical, and I told him so. He looked much better on the profile than he actually looked. But it was not a question of his physical appearance, but more of what he was giving off. It was, on the profile, like open guy, kind and positive, and here was a guy who was calling and did not appear to be easygoing at all. I sent him a message. He looked down and did not even answer it. I was almost in front of him, and he saw very well, and he did not have the balls to reply, even on Grindr." So you get a sense of an encounter in which people are co-present in the traditional sense, but also aware of one another and their own proximity for what happens on screen. And you see a typical concern of that type of hybrid encounter, which is for participants to try to orient to what they perceive as possible matches or mismatches between what they see on screen and what they see in the real life. And it's and to also issues of identification. You see, identification, recognition, and matching are characteristic of hybrid encounters because hybrid encounters provide you two different mediated access to the other. One is traditional co-presence, and the other is what the application makes you aware of in the other person on screen. So you always get these issues of mutual recognition. Is the person I see on screen the person I see in front of me, or vice versa? And are both types of information matching or not matching? And here this was amplified by the fact that it was a dating application, but still it's something you get in most of these encounters. You also see how these encounters play on a kind of a multiplexity of communication channels, because you can talk, you can send messages, and clearly that's a way to manage the trajectory of the encounter. And here you have an instance not only on a timid encounter, but we call that a frustrated encounter, because they got mutually aware of one another, but deliberately, one of them at least deliberately avoided acting upon that noticing and interacting with the other. So I think that accounts for the tone of frustration, that small narrative, that pervades that small narrative. This one is taken from a study I'm currently doing of the users of Tinder in Paris, another dating application, but in which location is a bit less salient than Grindr. It's mostly used, but not only, by the heterosexual users to organize some date at some point. And here, I worked very hard to have a part of a sample which belonged to the popular classes, because I saw that in the media, when we speak of that kind of application, it's always example of college students or young urban professionals, and we know very little about how popular users are using it. And so, this particular girl, which was from popular classes not in Paris, in a smaller city, she said this: "It's even a big inconvenience. My mom lives in the Cité." Cité in France, I think maybe you could have the projects. Projects in it's a low income, rather rough neighborhood. That's what it's called in Paris. Not in Paris, in France in general. My mom lives in the Cité. In the Cité, there are people who have this app. Recently, I saw a young guy from the hood on the app. He liked me and told me he liked me well. I get down the stairs and he's there with his pals. He sees me and he behaves as if he didn't know me. But on the app, he had made me. For me, it's a disadvantage that this kind of person, when you don't make them clearly, you never know what happens in their head. So here you get another type of timid encounter. They had met and interacted on Tinder, and they discover one another on the stairs. And you get a more threatening undertone here, because she's a woman. He's a guy with his band of pals, and the public space in the city is very much occupied by guys. So there's a kind of a threat which introduces us to the dark side, or potential dark side of these hybrid encounters. But again, it's focused on chance, serendipity, and the things you know on screen and the things you did know off screen with a particular person. So I think all these cases, and I could add more, have something in common somehow, this notion of hybrid encounter I'm trying to push to you. Yeah, I'm finishing. So the last idea I'd like to push forward is that if we do some perspective, because these applications, they are used by a fraction of the population, not so many people. If you imagine that kind of locative-aware social media and games would become pervasive somehow, then you would completely change the traditional notion of what a city is about. Because the default expectation in that case would not be that you meet strangers, but that you continuously meet people to which you are connected in this way through hybrid encounters. So a complete reversal. And that means that passerbys in public places would be people which would be simultaneously available by sight and on screen, and giving rise to these multi-layered encounters. To give you an example taken from a series you probably know, which is Black Mirror, and I think this particular episode is very well known. It's an episode in which people imagine people having some kind of social, everybody has some kind of social credit applications, which rank them according to the kind of interactions they have. So not the same way the Chinese credit system is working right now. And that's not what interests me, but because they have that means that the application also allows them to recognize other people close by and provide them with information on their profile. And here, so this episode clearly imagines a world in which everybody is connected in some sense in the way I've been describing. And this is an encounter between two vague acquaintances. The woman have seen another at work in a lift.
A little bit about us. We were formed in 1991, so 1991 is obviously quite a while ago, and it was an era sort of pre-mobile phones pretty much, and I think we had one computer when we first started out that wasn't connected to the internet. And our impulse was really, we came from a range of different backgrounds. We had more in common really in our taste in films and our politics really, rather than having a distinct idea of the kind of work that we wanted to make. And so we were DJs, dancers, theatre makers, artists, installation artists, sculptors. And so all of our work was multidisciplinary from the outset, really. And that was a consequence of the fact that we didn't really have an integrated practice. We just knew that we wanted to make something. There are about a dozen of us, and the first works that we showed were generally promenade performances that combined music, combined drinking, were normally at found venues, so it had the sense of coming to a party or an evening or an event rather than coming to a piece of performance or art. And that was key for us. It was really about harnessing that energy and the excitement about socializing as much as it was around creating something that was had something smart to say, and hopefully some of our work had something smart to say. That was a long time ago. So Blastery now, I keep having to update this list because it keeps changing about who we are and what we do, but we make a range of different work. So some of it is city-based, location-based performance, and Operation Black Antler, which I'll talk about, is actually one of those pieces. But we also make art which is exclusively consumed online or via apps. And we also make work that sits in museums and galleries. So I guess part one is to really talk about some of the lessons we've learned in the course of making our work. And as I say, when we first started making work, we were looking at, well, we tended to make events that took place in things like old industrial units, in shops, empty churches, and we would bring people to those spaces, and then we would ask them to just wander around, and some of those things involved using technology, so we often used interactive projection systems. We had like a Mac Quadra, which was, I think, was the first Macintosh that you could get a video input into, and then we took apart the keyboard and we could solder sensor pads into it so that we could trigger video as people walked around a space. So that was all part of it. But really, we weren't led by technology. Our impulse was really about finding ways that we could invite people to reflect on some of the kind of key questions that were important to us. But we made work in this vein and in this format for about 7 or 8 years until 1998. So we had been doing some research around a particular case that was going to the European Court of Human Rights, it was colloquially known as the Spanner Trial. And it was a case where a number of gay men had taken part in a sadomasochistic party, and they had videoed themselves taking part in this party, and the video had got into the hands of the police, and the police had decided to prosecute some of the participants in the party for things like grievous bodily harm. So, and we found this kind of paradoxical, that this notion that people could be consensual in activities that might be harmful to them and still be prosecuted by it. So we decided to try and make a piece of work, a performance about the pleasures of giving up control. And for a long time, probably several months, the format of the work involved us as performers doing our usual thing, which was standing in front of an audience and doing all kinds of odd things and trying to impress people with how intriguing or important that might be. But actually, watching people who are performers ordering each other around and telling each other to get undressed is actually a thing that's quite commonplace and isn't that exciting. So we decided we would flip the thing around, and in a kind of moment of revelation, decided that we were going to ask the audience to give over power to us and make a piece of work where we actually invited the audience to become the subject of the work. And this, I guess, has been a principle which has been a principle that's ongoing for the rest of the work that we make, where we see the audience as being a kind of key cast member in all of the projects that we make, and that we always write them into the description of what it is that we're doing. They're not spectators, they are protagonists. Kidnap was also interesting for us in a couple of other ways. It really invited us to reflect on what is the space that we could make work in. So, as I say, we'd been previously making work in locations around the city that we could find, that we could get permission. But because the nature of kidnapping people, did I actually explain what Kidnap is, by the way? Did I miss that? I might miss that. So Kidnap is a project where we ran a lottery, and the 2 winners of the lottery were kidnapped by us and held hostage for 48 hours. And over the course of 48 hours, that their captivity was streamed online. So the kind of lessons about space. I think the first was really understanding that the technology that we had to use, because kidnapping obviously isn't a thing you can bring a lot of people to come and watch. It's quite tricky. Was that we had to use technology to make it accessible. And by employing the internet and using distributed technologies, we realized there's actually a whole space where this event can take place independently of us actually being physically present. Stupid, but at the time that was a realization that was important. And the other was realizing that the piece of work could actually take place in people's heads as opposed to anything that we actually did in person, physically in front of people. So on the day of the kidnapping, we actually had a phone call from someone who said they left a message on the free phone number that we had published for the project, saying that they were in their house, they were looking out the window, and they could see us waiting in a van to come and kidnap them. And we weren't actually at their house at all. But they spent the day waiting for us to come and collect them. And we found that this was intriguing, that the sort of the waves and the effects of what the piece of work might involve things that we hadn't planned, and there might be emergent characteristics to the work. So the second, I suppose, pillar of the kind of the way that we've thought about work is this notion of mixed reality. And one of the key collaborators that we've had over the last 20 years is an HCI research group based at the University of Nottingham called the Mixed Reality Lab, led by a professor called Professor Steve Benford. And in the course of the 90s, their interest was around the way that virtual spaces and physical spaces might merge, and how virtual technology and those immersive 3D environments of the time might sort of transform the topology of physical spaces. So they were looking at virtual offices and virtual meeting rooms, but also looking at entertainment spaces and play spaces and how those could be used. And so some of the staff who then worked at the lab went on to projects like Second Life. But over the early 2000s, that really switched to mobile technology, and that led us to make a piece of work called Can You See Me Now, which is one of our seminal pieces of work in terms of thinking about how these electronic spaces can be overlaid onto real physical spaces. And for us, the key is really that our reality is one which is a staccato kind of movement from one place, one set of references. And I think when Christian was talking about that sort of sense of there being a disjunction between these different layers, I think that's something that is important for us in considering our audience and how they're involved in a piece of work. So the third kind of concept for us is around pervasive gaming. So one of the areas of research that we were involved in was really looking at how games can really break outside of some of the traditional boundaries of game worlds. And so works like Uncle Roy, All Around You, which was from 2003, and Can You See Me Now, employ one of the kind of properties of this, which is normally games take place within a confined physical boundary within which the game is always the game and outside of which the game is not. And so for us to make this to make work which takes place in the city and for there to be a permeable boundary between these two spaces was very important. And the other is over time. So a sort of there's normally a temporal boundary in terms of gaming where you start the game and you end the game, and within that time frame, those things, there's a kind of clear sort of sense of when you're playing, when you're not. And for us, again, this was a property that we thought we could fruitfully make more permeable. And so obviously mobile devices where you're interleaving all kinds of activity on a single device, from texting your mum through to checking your Facebook page through to I don't know. There would these things are things that sit alongside each other. And so one of the projects we made called Karen really try to take advantage of this. So the fourth and final one, which I think is kind of the hardest, I found the hardest to describe. It really came up when we were talking yesterday around subjectivity in play. I think for us, the perspective is really around presence and liveness. One of the things we've always said about our work is that our intent is to make work that is live, and that has a number of multiple meanings. I think one of the meanings for us is really around making sure that people who are participating in our projects actually feel like there's something at stake, that it will have meaning or a value outside of the 30 minutes or 90 minutes that they might be involved in taking part in it, that it has impacts beyond the experience itself. Oh, so I was going to share a clip, but I'm running out of time, so I'll skip. So on to one of our more recent pieces of work. I think this sort of ticks some of those boxes in terms of the principles that we've used in developing work. So it's a project called Operation Black Antler, and it is it's a project where you are invited to take the role of an undercover police officer and make a judgment as to whether you could justify police surveillance on a group of people that you are told to go and investigate. So this was a response to partly the Investigatory Powers Bill. It's now an act in the UK, which gives the government sort of not sweeping. I'm told they're kind of quite. It gives them powers to gather bulk electronic data about communications, but also in response to this specific case, which was a department of the Metropolitan Police, which undertook long-term surveillance over a period of about 40 years in the UK, and their surveillance program, it was called the Special Demonstration Squad, placed undercover officers in groups such as environmental action groups and animal rights groups, and even in trade unions. And in some cases, officers entered into relationships with people that they were targeting for surveillance, and also had children with those people. So I suppose the third starting point has really been Brexit. Actually, we were making the work in the course of the sort of Brexit referendum, and we actually showed the work. We actually had the show the night of the Brexit referendum. That wasn't a very nice night. And Brexit, I think, has really sort of come about from an anxiety in the UK around sort of globalization, and I think it's kind of commonplace. And I think there's probably better people who can talk about what that is in that respect. But one of the outcomes has been really a sort of mainstreaming of kind of right-wing views, and a sense that people are able to talk more openly about things that are, I suppose, if you're a liberal, they're kind of quite contentious. So combining these two things, we really tried to put together an experience which really placed people at the centre of a problem, really, to present them with a dilemma. And I think what we devised was an experience where we actually invite people to investigate a far-right group and question whether surveillance of people who express views that are different to yours would actually be justified. So the experience starts on a street corner. Well, it starts when you buy a ticket, so we do actually charge for this. And once you've bought a ticket, you'll receive a text message which invites you to go to a street corner. And there you'll meet 8 other people, probably strangers, who are also waiting. And having assembled, you'll then be invited to a location where you're briefed about a surveillance operation, and you're given a role in the surveillance operation where you have to undertake to try and find a person of interest. So the person of interest will be your target, and your goal is to actually uncover information about that person and decide whether surveillance of that person long term is justified. So this is so you'll start in a safe house. You're then led to a pub where there's a a gig is taking place. So this is it transpires that the gig is a fundraiser for a young girl who's in the local community, and she is trying to raise money to join the Territorial Army, which is like a sort of reserve army in the UK. So if you meet your POI, your person of interest, and you gain their trust, you're then invited to a back room where you meet someone who is a known member of a fictitious far-right organisation that we have briefed you about called National Resistance. At the end of the project, you're then asked to leave the pub. You receive a call from one of the undercover officers who's also in the pub, and he tells you to meet them outside. And there you're invited to discuss whether you believe that the far-right group or the people that you've met in the pub should be put under surveillance or not. Following that, you're then told that the piece is over and you're invited to go to a local bar, and you actually meet all the people who are, over the course of the project, actually taking part in the event. And you get to talk about what the ethics of surveillance are, and you get to see and hear additional information about surveillance. So I know I'm running over, so I'm going to try and do this in like a minute. So I just thought I'd talk about the project in practice. So it's actually done, it's quite a big cast. It's cast about 20 to 30 people. And the cast are sort of recruited through a sort of community process. So they are people who, these are all the people that you see who will be in the pub when you go to the pub, who are pretending to be sort of far-right supporters, although some of them aren't, it turns out. So each of them will develop a character based on a kind of process of interviews and talking about their experiences of sort of far-right kind of views. We managed to get about 200 people through the show every night, and that's based on 9 people starting every 15 minutes. In the background, we have some infrastructure which lets us do sort of automated text messaging. It's what we send sort of template messages. We have a control room, which in Manchester was actually in the back of a van. So we had 2 SMS operators who are sending several hundred text messages to people with a kind of templating system that lets them kind of have all these conversations with people simultaneously. And this kind of gives you some idea of how it sits across the path of the city. So the 2 green markers are the starting locations where people assemble. There's a yellow point, which is the safe house where they receive a briefing. I think the orange cocktail glass is where the gig takes place, where they then meet people from the far-right group. They then there's a conclusion where they meet Swift, who's one of the undercover officers outside, and then they move to a venue where they can then just talk about their experience. So the one thing I think I really wanted to point out is that although we make things that often are called games and are ostensibly interactive, lots of our work is actually quite instructive and linear. You know, we are actually in the business of making theatre. We actually make very bad games. You know, people arrive in their group of 9, we split them into a group of 3, and we give them a role. But what I think the space where it really comes to life is when they get to the pub. So this is the gig. So when they arrive at the pub, there's probably 50 people there, and of them, 8 people in our cast will have been briefed that they are members of this far-right group, and that's how, if you go and talk to them, that's the kind of views that they will express. But then we also have 6 people who are just regulars. They're just like normal members of the public. There's also the 9 of you that you've come with, but there's also potentially 27 other people who are audience members who are all pretending to be far-right sympathisers. And so within this space, we have any number of unplanned conversations about what are the issues around surveillance, or what are the issues around migration. And I think that's the kind of space that we really didn't plan and is kind of unexpected. And for us, the work that we make is really looking at how can we nurture a place where people can talk in new ways and find a new voice that lets them understand things from a different perspective and really talk about things. And for us, this kind of space that we made in a pub where people are pretending to be far-right sympathisers, and then the subsequent space where they have to then make judgments around surveillance, and then the subsequent space where they can then reflect on the entire experience. The goal for all of us, for us in all of the making of these, is to really place the people in those situations that allows them to find a new way to talk. That's it. Thank you.
I've been really interested in what the CRDN has been doing for a long time, because I think you've kind of been ahead of the game in a sense, particularly with the focus on kind of interdisciplinary approaches and also that translational research. And I'm coming to that kind of, what I'm trying to do with this talk is actually think about what it means to do translational research. And so there's going to be it's a bit of a kind of, I'm going to be throwing a few living labs out there, and they're kind of work in progress, just because I wanted to kind of think through some of the ways that we can do this. This talk is very much focused on methods as well, so for me, methods are something that come out of the research practice. And I'm particularly, one of the areas that I really like to work in is ethnography and bringing different approaches to the ethnography or ethnographic lens. My colleagues and myself at RMIT, we really think about ethnography as not just a method, it is actually a conceptual lens. So it's a way of seeing the world, it's a way of doing the world. It puts humans at the centre, it puts the messiness of practice at the centre. And so that's something that really kind of informs everything we do. I also want to say that in this talk I'm informed by the idea of social practice, which comes out of kind of art, particularly in a kind of post-relational settings where social is the medium. So that's something that I'm also really interested in. But I thought I'd just give you a little bit of a backgrounder to where I started in terms of thinking about hybrid play, and also the idea of digital wayfaring. So I just want to kind of highlight that the kind of two things that has been apparent over the last 2 days in terms of hybrid play has been, kind of entanglement between place, bodies, media and play. And, some people have emphasised more the bodies, some have emphasised more the place, some people have emphasised more the media, and some people have emphasised more the play. Digital wayfaring, which I'll talk about in a moment, has another type, is an entanglement very similar. It's an entanglement between people, places, media, but also movement. And movement is at the core of its understanding. So it puts body and the knowledge of the body moving through the world at the centre point. But anyway, so this is where I started. In 1999, in Japan, I was doing an artist residency there, and I came across Machiko and her phone. And I think this is the best metaphor for thinking about that kind of wayfaring and the role of the mobile media in that. So for Machiko, mobile media had always played an integral role in her practices of intimacy and placemaking. So this is her Keitai, her mobile phone. And as you can see, it's covered with Hello Kitties. And these different Hello Kitties represent a different place in Japan. So there's Harajuku Hello Kitty, Shinjuku Hello Kitty, Takadanababa Hello Kitty. And each one is a different experience with a different person. And so in a sense, in a Western context, we would think about this in terms of the charm bracelet. And so she's actually carrying around her experiences. They're always visible, so that she's always reminded of place, of the importance of place. And I think this is a great metaphor, because what happens is personalisation starts to go internally, and it's harder to kind of actually do that kind of mapping. But the same kind of personalisation practices are occurring. So it's about this kind of collection of memories and experiences of place. It is also an incubator for wayfaring and intimacy and social proprioception. So social proprioception is the concept that Jason Farman looked at in his book, The Mobile Interface, where it's this idea of knowledge through movement. So it's also about this idea of placemaking. And it's also just really, how could you lose a phone like this? When phones were so tiny, it's like, right, no, that's definitely my phone. That's got those Hello Kitties. But we can see here, these early stages of mobile media personalisation practices helped embed place with wayfaring and also with mundane cartographies. And so it helped her through the emotional and geographic spaces and places. So nearly 20 years later, the role of mobile media in urban spaces has taken on greater complexity, with the contesting cartographies that are both digital and non-digital. This is a process what myself and Sarah Pink, an anthropologist at RMIT, have called digital wayfaring. That is the entanglements, and I'm using Christian's concept of encounters, or as Nick was talking about, invitations, in which the digital is interwoven in the knowing of the world in and through movement. Digital wayfaring attends to the various ways in which social proprioception is heightened through mobile media. So as the material gets increasingly entangled with the digital, tracing and understanding the playful nature of contemporary media can provide much insight into our everyday movements and placemaking practices. It is not by accident that many indie game designers are evoking and looking towards earlier models of corporeal techniques in urban spaces, such as that deployed by the Situationists International and the New Games movement of the 70s, as a way to rethink contemporary forms of play. These earlier movements encouraged types of collective, social and political play in everyday life through techniques such as drifting and non-conventional ways of moving through the city, like the derive. Through the integration of digital play into corporeal urban encounters, we can get a better understanding of the relationalities between material and digital, and also the inequalities that traverse these worlds. However, with the ubiquity of datification, which I started to kind of tap on yesterday, urban spaces are becoming colonialised. Personalisation, once, a kind of good term, because it was kind of seen as an empowerment tool for mobile media users, has become what Van Dijkers sees as an exploitation of the datification logic. This brings questions to the remit of critical cartography movements that sought through everyday mobile media technologies to democratise maps and placemaking. So yesterday I talked through some of the examples of the paradoxes surrounding Pokemon Go in terms of that kind of hybrid reality, and some of the kind of problems that unevenness of bodies in urban spaces and how that translates to digital spaces. So I won't rehash that too much for you. See, remember yesterday? We'd only just begun, and now we're at the end. And of course, this one always gives me a bit of a laugh. But I would argue that understanding the ethnographic, the social, and the creative dimensions of cartography and placemaking matters even more as datification and visualizations take hold. Small data via ethnographic interventions by the like of Dawn Nafis or Kate Crawford or Dana Boyd all point to not only exposing the foibles of programmed bias of big data, but also the importance of the social and creative methods in this disavowal. So, as I also pointed to yesterday with the kind of the creative drawings, I don't know if anyone has Strava, but excellent. Okay. Oh, did you? Right. Okay. All right. So, as a this is really this kind of reclaiming that data in that kind of self-tracking and doing that kind of messing with the original intentions of the app is really something that's been core to mobile media's kind of history. It's always been messed with. If you look at the way the industry has always talked about these killer apps, actually it's been the non-killer apps that always kind of took off. So this is something really important to the kind of history of mobile media that I think needs to be remembered. And also I pointed to yesterday is the unfit bits. So also pushing back against that quantified self and that kind of datification. So in the definition of hybrid play as outlined by the Symposium remit, it is understood as new forms of communication and artistic expression and new ways of interacting with and understanding the world. But it can also be seen as a vehicle for alternative knowledge transmission, translational research, and also about implementing it in the real world. There's a few key concepts that I'm going to be talking about in this talk, which is hybrid play, digital wayfaring, and playful resistance. So I will actually give some definitions for So digital wayfaring, sorry, I've just zipped ahead of my... So firstly, this concept came out of the work from Tim Ingold. So Tim Ingold talks about wayfaring, and it's really interesting the way that he makes us think in more kind of complex ways about the power of walking. And if you speak to any human resources people, what they'll do is they might interview people like on a desk, well, not on a desk, though, in a desk office setting. But what happens is more and more people are trained to perform in those contexts. And so there's this idea that you're not really getting the a sense of really who they are. So one of the techniques that they use is walking, because people find it harder to lie when they're walking. So try that next time. But it is really interesting what walking does to our thinking, and also the way that words and kind of concepts come from it. So wayfaring is the idea that knowledge is produced through the action of walking. Through the process of walking, ideas and talking have a different relationality. They take on an embodied sense of knowing and being in the world. As explored with Sarah Pink, contemporary entanglements between the online and offline can be interpreted through the conceptual and embodied metaphor of digital wayfaring. Here we revise Tim Ingold's notion of wayfaring as a type of embodied mobility, and we define it to talk about the way in which the digital can be used to reflect upon the ways in which, to reflect upon the ways in which the digital entangles itself in our everyday practices and movements, especially through mobile media. So in a sense, that digital wayfaring is quite similar to that idea of the lens of the hybrid, in terms of trying to complicate those on-off, online, offline, digital, non-digital, because as we know, we leave traces in both, and we're constantly leaving traces in both. Okay, so that's the Pokemon Go thing. The experience of wayfaring is further complicated within a hybrid reality games. Digital wayfaring through hybrid play presents different potentialities and tropes for understanding the important role of play in localities, or what Doreen Macy has called stories so far. And I think this is probably why ethnographers are so interested in the idea of place and locality, is the idea that ethnography is about the stories that we tell. It's about the making sense of the world through the stories we tell. In particular, sometimes the rules of the physical are not easily adapted into the game world, and vice versa, and the game activity can defamiliarise the routines and habits of urban mobility. Here it is important to highlight the uneven ways in which players come to the game space and the complexity of gameplay, as it is interwoven in our cultural and corporeal situationist in the world. That is, certain bodies have more latitude to deviate from normalised practices while others don't. And I talked about this in detail through the Pokemon Go example yesterday. So what I want to do now is I'm going to take you through two different projects in which I've tried to explore digital wayfaring in practice. So as I said, it's me trying out translational research, which I think for the next generation of academics is really important, because I think this is where the academy is out in the real world, and this is where you can actually make that difference. So there's been quite a few papers talking about social change, and it's about the methods that we use to kind of create those kind of those changes. So I think, as interdisciplinary researchers and designers and critical thinkers in this space, we need to think about the ways in which we can deploy decades of hybrid play techniques like blast theory to challenge inequalities and to activate everyday context into a site for activism and transformation. And I think Nick mentioned this in the opening talk about the power of the interdisciplinary, but also how it's kind of being emptied out of the power because it gets so overused. So he used the term of undisciplined. And I think however you want to kind of frame it, it's about the idea that real world problems actually happen outside disciplines. And so we actually need those kind of methods in order to actually address their complexity. And so one of the ways in which I've done that is thinking about the idea of playful resistance. And so as I talked about yesterday, playful resistance can be seen as a tautology, like that isn't playful being resistant, especially my 8-year-old at 3 o'clock this morning. That was very resistant to the whole I'm going to be okay. and that play has been fundamentally a form of resistance and questioning and innovation and provocation. And it is interesting how much play is fought over as well in terms of disciplines. So in game studies, it has its own kind of bounded understanding. Then you go out into kind of sociology or anthropology, it has its own histories. And as I said yesterday, like Bart Simon kind of talks about these kind of the psychologists fighting with the sociologists about who actually owns play and whether it should be an intrinsic thing or whether it's about a sociality that's extrinsic. So I'm just going to turn to a couple of the examples that I looked at yesterday in terms of those kind of playful resistance. So here's the unfit bit. So if you haven't seen that, they put it on a metronome. So it's like continuously going. So you really get your steps up there, like really well. And it's kind of pushing you back against the idea that, like Fitbits, etc., all that data is being used by health companies, etc., to frame insurance and things like that. So, how healthy you are. This is actually one of my ex-PhD students, Rohit Kaur, who did this. He did his PhD on what he wanted to basically materialise the invisible, and he argued that QS. The thing about QS is that it limits all the exciting things that data could do. It limits it to numbers, and that numbers really aren't what make us human. And so he argued that we need to think differently about data, and it's actually through those small acts that we can intervene. So he actually tried to materialise the immaterial or the invisible, aka sweat. So this is actually what he does. He puts a heart monitor on, and people took these home, and they had the heart monitor, and they wore it during the day, and at the end they linked it up to their 3D printer, and the 3D printer had different types of artefacts that it could print. So you can see there's a frog, or there's the sun one, or there's the dice. And basically what it does is it does a summary of your day, and it gives you it as something you can wear, like a necklace or a ring, or, so that you actually have a different way of thinking about your exertion, rather than just numbers. He went on to do it with chocolate as well, so how many steps you do. Oh, yeah, I'm going to get that Mars bar. Yeah, or whatever, what is it? And then he also did it with cocktails as well for the drinkers in the room. Yes, so so that's a different way to motivate. We see a lot of things about gamification. And the thing is, he would argue that he's not gamifying things, he's taking a playful angle, because there are those people who in game studies think that gamification is bad because it's emptying out games. It's taking all the kind of mechanics of games without actually understanding the complexity. And I'm sure Nick and Andrea can talk in great detail about that. And we've already had blast theory, so, I can just signpost, yes. I also mentioned yesterday Zach Blass's work, which, a lot of his work critiques things like facial recognition software. And then I also mentioned the Russian photographer who'd gone on the St. Peter's metro, taken random pictures of people and then used facial software to find them on social media and then contrasting them. And what you always see is, surprise, surprise, on social media they look much more happier, don't they, and prettier and things like that. So, okay, so now I'm going to take you for a little walk through two projects. Now, pretty much all of my work is collaborative. So when I say I'm actually meaning eyes. So there's many of us. And that's a really important part of that process. I like working collaboratively. I like working with people from different disciplines because they challenge what I think are the limits of my discipline. So both of these are three-year projects. So I was quite lucky to get funding for these two areas. Both were ethnographically informed. So we followed participants for 3 years. So we got a really kind of deep sense of their practices over time, because time does a really interesting thing with practice in terms of being able to kind of see those kind of shifts. So the two projects, I just put some material here about methods, which I think this is a fantastic book if you're not aware of it. Lurie and Wakefield's book, Inventive Methods. It comes from a mainly sociological focus, but it's really great in terms of thinking about the messiness of methods and actually how methods need to be born out of the research topic. And I'm going to give you a sense of why that matters when I talk you through one of my projects, which actually had to be, the whole research question got changed because my participants who, and I think we've seen some really, in the last panel, the discussion of participants as, like audience members. As, what was the term that you were using, Nick, for audience members? Protagonists. So actually giving them, and so when I work with participants, I often call them the experts. Okay, and I see them as co-designing with me, and it's a kind of journey that we do together. And I think it's really important to think about how you're doing your research, how you can shape those methods constantly, and how you need to communicate with more diverse audiences and users. And I think Law's quote in particular, if the world is complex and messy, then, basically we need to give up on those kinds of simplicities. We need to actually build really robust methods that actually address all those complexities and all those kind of messiness. And I think Laurie's point about if all methods are to be inventive, they should not leave the problem untouched. And I think that's really core to thinking about, the kind of inherent nature of methods as, informed through the research. And so particularly with the two projects I'm going to talk about, I really want to focus on the last question, how can we think about hybrid play in terms of translational research or knowledge transmission? Because more and more I haven't wanted to talk to, my peeps at the university and actually think about taking it back to the context that it came from the real world and what might be the best translational pathways. So the first project was a project looking at climate change and the role of artists to provide alternative narratives in the climate change debate. So we know with the Anthropocene that that it gets politicised. So we had a Prime Minister, like the last Prime Minister, who actually said that climate change didn't exist. High IQ, as you can see. And he was, and actually he picked out this project because it had two things that he didn't think existed, art and climate change. Yeah, gotta love it. But he was doing that because economically it's really hard. If a Prime Minister or a President actually acknowledges how we are stuffing up the world, then they've got to act on it, and that's really expensive, and it's economically not really viable. So it's easier just to kind of say it doesn't exist. So one of the other things that I really like doing is working cross-culturally, because I like to kind of think about similarities and contrasts. So what can we learn from each different culture? So this project was it was 3 sites: Melbourne, Tokyo and Shanghai. And when we started the project, we had 3/11 happened. So the Fukushima disaster, nuclear disaster, etc. So it started with tsunami, etc. So things radically changed in Japan at that moment. For those that aren't aware, when it happened, the government contacted NHK, which is the equivalent. It's like BBC or CBN, or it's like one of the big multinational kind of broadcast channels. The government contacted them and said, "Oh, look, looks like one of the reactors is kind of, don't tell anyone yet. Just hold on it for 6 hours while we just get our story straight." Now, can you imagine that happening in America? Or it's shh, Anyway, it wouldn't happen in Australia either. Anyway, so what happened was that, of course, the public found out about it, and you can imagine what happened. Big backlash. So up until that point, Japan had actually had quite a lot of had a lot of trust in their broadcast companies, and after that, just completely. So everyone went to Twitter, everyone went to Instagram, everyone went to social media as their kind of barometer for truth and fact. And so this presented a really interesting challenge for us in terms of, okay, if we want to actually engage with everyday audiences, actually the moment now is using Twitter and Instagram, because this is where everybody is on all the time. Because one of the things that happened with the disaster, and myself and Yoni Kim did a study on it, in terms of the way that mobile media operated for people when they were trapped, because people ended up being trapped and not being able to contact because the networks went down, and so they weren't actually able to contact loved ones. So they actually carried around the phone like it was their loved one, and it became, the digital actually took on this quite deep material kind of embodied experience. And these are the kind of realities of the landscape afterwards. And so what we did was we set up a shipping container in, which wasn't lost on the whole kind of tsunami disaster, a shipping container in a very busy park in Shibuya. And our reason for choosing there, we worked with a Japanese organisation called the Boat People Association, which is actually, it's a group of architects, activists, etc., who work to kind of think about Japan, and particularly Japan of the new, in terms of Japan of the old. And so one of the things is in Japan, water really is a really important part of the culture. And you have in Tokyo a whole lot of underground streams. So the project was actually about looking at those hidden streams that were there, those kind of hidden cartographies, and making them apparent. Because when you walk around Tokyo, if you've been there, the thing that becomes really apparent is all the streets and the neon signs and the trainways, etc. But water doesn't really seem to be really there. And so we wanted to actually do a project that got people thinking about it. So we put a shipping container in the site for a month, and we did a whole lot of different performances. So there was a whole lot of us. There was walking through sewers tours and things like that. And the one that I did was with my collaborators was Keitai Mizu, which is basically mobile water. And I got a whole lot of Japanese and Australian artists to make work for the site, so it was site-specific, and we put it around the park. And what happened was that users came along and they had to collect as many pictures of the artwork as possible to win within 10 minutes. What was really interesting was, and because we really wanted to use the kind of, in that hybrid play sense, that idea of where does a game start and end, at what points? And where does the art begin and end? And we had some really interesting situations where people were photographing rubbish, thinking it was the art, and then other people thinking that the art was rubbish. So if you can see some of the things that were used there. And so it was really about mixing up, kind of that hybridity concept in terms of getting people to kind of question what they're seeing, what it actually is. And so here you can see them kind of walking around. And so it became very social in terms of people kind of trying to decode what was there, because the artwork was just put in the grass and things like that. So it really, the context really confused people. And even I had some art people come along and they couldn't tell the difference, which I knew was an absolute success. If the connoisseurs have been brought down, then yes. And what also became really interesting was this idea of co-presence and ambient play. So one of the really interesting things about mobile hybrid play is the fact that it is ambient. And I think in the last session, we saw that idea of music as a metaphor for thinking through those movements. And ambient, as we know, it comes from a kind of, that's kind of sound background. It means to move in and out of the background, foreground, etc. And I think this is a really interesting way of thinking about how mobile play operates in everyday life. The next project I'll quickly talk through was a project, a 3-year project looking at mobile games in Australia. It was the first longitude study to do 3 years. We got 60 households and we followed them for 3 years. And when we started off, we actually thought that we were looking at humans and media entanglements. But what we realised over about a year and a half was a question was completely wrong. And this also feeds into the panel just before, in terms of animals. We hadn't actually worked out how animals operate in those kind of domestic contexts. And then we actually realised that we needed to think about humans, media, and more than humans in that entanglement. Because animals just kept getting in the way. And then we realised they weren't just getting in the way. They weren't just sitting on keyboards. They weren't just being used on social media. They are actually an integral part of the playful dynamics happening in a home context. And so then we had to really think, oh my God, how do you do ethnographies of non-humans? Like this is really, so there's a great Anne Galloway, who's a designer in New Zealand. She does sheep ethnographies, okay? So just look it up. It's really fascinating. It's kind of speculative design stuff, but it's that idea that, particularly in the kind of context of the Anthropocene, how do we start to think about things that aren't just always human-centric, but have practice at the centre and have movement and bodies. And so we started coming up with these concepts like, kind of careful surveillance that was kind of going on, because we had some of our participants actually had pet wearables, we had never even thought about pet wearables. By the way, in Australia, pets are big. We spend a lot of money on pets. Some people say it's like surrogate children, but we won't even go there. But anyway, we love our pets. We have pet psychologists, etc. Anyway, so these pet things actually, allowed people to kind of have that presence in the home, particularly for pets that might be a bit needy. So one of our participants, Andrew, he had actually set up this whole thing. So he had the tag and everything. And so when because the dog kept eating the couch, he'd be watching it the whole time. And so he's at work, good job that he has. And then he's like watching this dog like biting away. And then he kind of like realizes that, so he actually has a voiceover that can say, "Stop it, fish, stop it." And fish kind of looks around. It's like, "Dad's home. What's going on? Quick," And he could also map, in terms of the home, the emotional cartography. So he could realise the states of which his dog was feeling because what room it was in. So certain rooms have certain feelings. And so he was actually able to get a really kind of complex cartography of what was happening in the home. So we did this field work, and then we wanted to basically take it back into the community. So how can we feed it back to families, etc. So we did an exhibition, which was, as you can see, had the Minecraft background. It had Lego and Minecraft throughout it, and it was basically about this idea of. So here you can see, and you can see on the right-hand side, there's pictures there. So that wall started off empty, and then over the exhibition time, as people come along, they can move the installation any way they want, and then they have to photograph themselves in it and put it on social media. So the wall started to fill up with all of them. So actually, they became the artists. So they were the players, and then they were artists. So it's really nice having them moving through these different kind of spaces. And by the end, the wall had filled up, and it was all their artwork. But we also did a whole lot of, so this project worked with the Young and Well CRC, which was committed to young people and well-being. And so what we wanted to do is counter the narratives of, say, psychiatrists who are all saying, like, media is bad and it's destroying children. And children used to be so pure when they could go out in the paddocks, and now it's bad. And so this kind of feeds back into some of the earlier discussion that I think Shira's talking about in terms of, like, those kind of media effects models, which are really easy because then you don't actually have to take responsibility as a society. So we worked with Young and Well CSC with a whole lot of different schools to get them to think about their digital wayfaring and play. So what we did was we asked them to bring along their favourite games, work in collaboration as designers to design a physical game that relates to the digital game, and to think about what translates between the digital and the physical and what doesn't. And so we had a lot at that time. Crossy Roads was really big, which is like Frogger. And so a lot of them involved crossing roads or treacherous things and things like that. But it was really interesting because afterwards they had real insight into what translates in terms of those hybrid play spaces in digital and physical spaces. So they did a lot of kind of making up. And so this is one of our participants who, basically talked about how she felt quite different going back to that game space. We also made a social play toolkit, which could be taken to schools and things like that. And so toolkits can be a really useful way of that kind of thinking about translational research, so how other kind of people can take it up. Okay, there we go. Okay, I can see you standing up, so I'm like, great, okay. So, so they're just two examples of thinking about how we might do translational research, particularly around the idea of hybrid play and digital wayfaring. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you. And are we going to bring up the other panel so that we can...
Right. If Christian and Nick and I don't